Today is Wednesday, June 4th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Elon Musk is done holding back about Trump's big, beautiful bill. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating if you haven't already. You can email us as well, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. That's our email address, right to our inbox, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Join me today to get through all the news of the craze. CBN's Trey Goins-Phillips. And on the focus story, Trey, we're going to take a look at some controversial comments made by Mark Driscoll.
Is anyone surprised that Mark Driscoll said something controversial once again? This time, though, it was about stay-at-home dads, and it's getting quite the debate started, so we'll talk about that.
Yeah, that'll be one that you should email us in on, because I would imagine we're going to have split decision here on this.
Yeah, for sure.
So quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Once we get through that, let's hear your reaction to it. On the main thing, Russia, did they just have their Pearl Harbor? How a surprise attack could change future war tactics. That conversation coming up on the main thing. Make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, including Billy's Newsmakers podcast, Trey's Faith and Culture, Abigail Robertson's Heaven Meets Earth podcast. You can subscribe to all three of those by finding the links in the description of this podcast episode. And with that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. And Elon Musk is slamming the GOP's latest big, beautiful bill, calling it a disgusting abomination, and accusing Congress of passing a pork-filled monster that undermines efforts to rein in government waste. The bill is backed by President Trump. It cleared the House mostly along party lines, but drew some fire from Elon Musk, who recently stepped down from his Doge activities. Musk says the bill undoes the progress his team made, slashing unnecessary spending. Trump hasn't fired back yet, but the White House did defend the bill, calling it necessary and popular among Republicans. Senate GOP leader John Thune acknowledged Musk's concerns, but says the bill only covers mandatory spending and promised a follow-up bill to address waste in other areas. Musk and Trump are expected to appear together at a press conference later this week. And a historian says he's uncovered strong evidence pointing to the real location of Jesus' first miracle, turning water into wine at a wedding in Cana. While tradition points to a place in northern Israel, Dr. Tom McCullough believes the true site is actually about 5 miles away from the previous site. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. This is interesting with Elon Musk here, Trey, kind of shots fired sort of a thing, kind of first time we're seeing a real disagreement here from a bill that President Trump has supported and has called the big, beautiful bill. And Musk, I saw in an interview, said, well, a bill can be big and beautiful, but I don't think it can be both at the same time. And he, of course, is going to feel maybe potentially slighted here, because the whole point of him being in the government was to try to cut waste. And then you see this big bill comes in that supposedly, according to projections, would add $4 trillion to the debt. He's not thrilled about it.
Well, I think that's a good line from Elon Musk, right? It can't be big and beautiful. I think that is a problem that has plagued DC forever, right, on both sides of the aisle. But you would think the party that has been concerned with fiscal responsibility, and this is just my take, would be aware that a huge bill is going to come with a huge cost, and there's no problem doing these things piecemeal, right? Why can't we pass just small bills that address things individually, and then you can amend them and revoke them and whatever as needed? But when you've got this omnibus massive bill, making any sort of changes or edits to it is virtually impossible. All it does is inflate the deficit. And by the way, it's interesting, like hearing Thune's reaction. Well, the spending in it was only necessary spending.
Yeah.
Well, who's the one that determines what's necessary spending?
Yeah.
The people in government. So it's I think it's kind of a funny defense of the bill, but it'll be interesting to see, given Trump's personality. We know Trump values loyalty above all else. So is he going to be able to handle some dissent that close to him, that close to his orbit, or is he going to kick him out?
Well,
It'll
and
be
I don't think,
interesting to see.
yeah, it will be interesting to see. And I don't think people should be surprised by this because Trump
No,
has never labeled himself a conservative. This guy was a Democrat for a
especially not
long time. He was
fiscally.
like, right, not fiscally. He's always been the first term he added to the debt and didn't really, knock that down because I don't think he necessarily views all of that as bad. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that he's okay with spending, that he's okay with doing this. One thing I will say that's frustrating is I don't like in these estimates. Now, this bill is clearly a big spending bill, so I'm not saying that. But on the other hand, I don't like when they use the phrase, well, these tax cuts are going to cost money, because
Right.
where
Yeah.
are you going to get the money from? It's like, well, guess what happens when people have more of their own money? They spend that money and the economy is stimulated, and then more jobs are created and more tax revenue comes in. So these, bean counters in the government or whoever's looking at these government bills, they always do this with taxes cuts. They always say, well, where are you going to make up the revenue from it? And they never account for the fact that the economy is going to do a little bit better. So, but that said, this is still a big spending bill. Regardless of that, I just take issue with the language on that. It tends to frustrate me, but
Yeah,
I
100%. I agree.
yeah, I digress. So let's go on to our focus story here, because this one we're going to want to talk about as well. And Mark Driscoll, like we talked about, he's a provocateur in some ways and likes to say things that will generate some conversation. He's never had a issue with doing that. And so what did he say this time about stay-at-home dads?
Yeah, so Driscoll, he's the former pastor of Mars Hill Church. He was obviously infamously removed from that role. The church no longer exists. Now, he is a pastor again in Scottsdale, Arizona, but he stated, this actually started on Mother's Day, but has kind of been a continuing conversation on Driscoll's social media. He said that men who choose to be stay-at-home dads are, quote, worse than a non-Christian. That assertion he was basing on 1 Timothy 5:8, which he has said, this has been kind of a pet verse of his for years now. In our story on faithwire.com, we posted a clip in there which he referenced this verse all the way back in 2008, talking about the need for men to not be in the home but out making an income, and the mother, of course, to be the primary caregiver in the house. But the crux of his argument is what 1 Timothy 5:8 says, which is Paul writing, if you're not taking care of your family and you're a Christian, you're worse than an unbeliever. He's speaking hyperbolically, right? He's the audience that he's talking to knows that, well, even non-Christians, they take care of their families. So how much more should us as Christians, we ought to be taking care of our families. But Driscoll is interpreting it literally, not adding that hyperbole that I think contextually is probably there. And he's saying, well, if you're not taking care of your family, then you're bound for hell, is another thing that Driscoll actually tweeted on Mother's Day. So it's an interesting kind of works-based interpretation of that verse. So I think the language here really is what's problematic more than even the message with Driscoll.
Yeah. And what have the comments been that he's received so far on this assertion he's made?
Yeah, so there have been the usual critics who are just not fans of Driscoll and his brash language, but then there have been some others who are not often critics of Driscoll who are voicing concern about his comments. Kristen Hawkins, the president of Students for Life of America, is one who's speaking out. She's criticized Driscoll's remarks. She stated that her husband, who has worked in the past but is not working outside of the home currently, is a stay-at-home father caring for their children, two of whom have cystic fibrosis, while she's continued to lead Students for Life for America. And she said that her husband is doing incredibly valuable work. He's a devout Christian, and he's an exemplary role model as a man and as a father, and said that really you should apologize to people like my husband who are doing this kind of work so that I can continue to advocate for the unborn. So she's challenging Driscoll's response, and that, of course, has gotten a lot of traction, probably just as much traction as Driscoll's initial comments.
And what are the stats on stay-at-home dads in the US?
So, stay-at-home fathers, in comparison to stay-at-home mothers, is still very much a minority, as anyone would expect. But 2021 research from the Pew Research Center found that about 2.1 fathers in the United States are stay-at-home dads. They make up about 20% of all stay-at-home parents. But the reasons for fathers staying at home vary quite a bit. 23% said that they do so to take care of their families. 13% said they do so because of being unemployed, and 34% said it's because of illness or disability, and then others said it's because they're older and they're already retired, that, or because they have a lack of education, so they can't find a job. So the people who are unemployed and the people who can't find a job, I can kind of understand where Driscoll is coming from, and I can see the validity to maybe some of his argument. But for the others, I think he's painting with quite a broad brush that I think is problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's probably where the issue comes in, is the conclusion that he's drawn there, because I think there is a conversation to be had. And again, this is where I say it's interesting, that it'd be interesting to hear what you all think that are listening to this podcast. What do you think on stay-at-home dads? Is it biblical or not? And of course, that's where we want to go for our ultimate authority on this issue. We don't want to go to like somebody else's example. Well, I do it and hear me roar. Like, well, so what? What does Scripture say about it, right? So when you look at it, you look at verses like 1 Timothy 8, the one that he's talking about there. You look at Genesis 3 after the fall, when God assigns Adam to toil and do the work, and the husband's the head of the wife, etc. You see in Ephesians. And so you see these things, and you're kind of left with, okay, the man is supposed to be the leader of the home. Now, what form that takes, I think those are discussions we can have, right? And I think because the Proverbs 31 woman does part of it, she is able to generate some income and be resourceful and things of that nature. So I don't know that the exact setup that you do is 100% clear. I think what you have to be mindful of and prayerful of is our household set up in a way where I am taking away from my wife's ability to be the primary caregiver of the home? That doesn't mean she can't work, but am I taking away from her ability to do that by not working? Or am I taking away from my ability to be leader of the home? We don't get specifics in Scripture on exactly what that looks like. I think we just have to have a prayerful approach to this. And I think that's what's unhelpful with Driscoll's comments, is it doesn't really leave room for that. I think the Bible's clear on sort of the types of things the male's supposed to do and the husband's supposed to do in a relationship, and the types of things the woman's supposed to do in a relationship. And I think as long as we're prayerfully considering those with how we set up our home, then I think we're going to end up usually landing in a place that's okay, and like weighing that against Scripture. But again, I think maybe the way Driscoll's saying it is a lot more black and white than it actually is.
Yeah, 100%. I think this is a nuanced issue. I think there are various ways that a couple could approach something. A well-meaning, biblically sound Christian couple can approach this, and it can look a little bit different in different seasons of life and in different situations, right? I mean, let's say a guy is getting his PhD or something, right? So his workload outside of the classroom is a bit smaller because school is taking up a lot of his time. So he's the one staying at home while his wife is working, and that's temporary, right? And then it's gonna flip. So,
Right.
I just think making these broad brush statements doesn't account for situations
Like that.
like that when
Right.
there's a bit more nuance that I think you need to take into account. And then also, like I said at the top, I have a big concern with the way that he interpreted that verse. And I am nowhere near a theologian or expert at all on exegesis of Scripture, but I don't think that's what Paul was saying. I don't think that he was saying if you are not out working at Walmart to provide an income for your family, then you're worse than an unbeliever and you're bound for hell. That is
Right.
not a correct interpretation of that verse. I think again, he's painting black and white, right? He's not leaving room for, oh, maybe Paul was being a bit hyperbolic. He was talking about the importance of taking care of your family. That's critical. If you're a lazy bum of a husband and you're not taking
Right.
care of your wife and you're not providing for your kids, then that's a problem. That's a hard
Yeah.
issue that you need to address.
Yeah.
But just because you're not, pulling a bunch of shifts at a store or doing whatever career you're qualified to do for whatever reason, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're in sin. It might be, but it's
Right.
not a sure conclusion.
Right. And again, that's why I'm saying, like, I think as each family has to prayerfully consider this and, again, weigh it against scripture and see where the Spirit opens your eyes on different scriptures like Proverbs 31 or Titus 2 or Ephesians. Just read through those and see if what you're doing lines up or if it takes away from what you can see God is calling you to do. Again, there's no exact way to do this. But I think you're right. Like, there are some extreme examples, right? If there's a guy just sitting at home and he's like, all right, honey, get out there and get working. And then she comes home and she's still got to cook dinner and do all this stuff. And you're just playing PlayStation. Well, no, you're not being the leader of the home and you're not providing for your home. Providing can look different ways. And again, I think you just got to weigh it against scripture and see and prayerfully consider and see how that's working out. But good conversation. Again, I appreciate you bringing that one, Trey. I think I'd love to hear from you guys. So email us. For sure. quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Let us know what you think. Would be very interested to hear your response. All right. We are going to head to the main thing now. And Russia's Pearl Harbor. Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Ivana Stradner and Ben Cohen catalog how Ukraine crippled Russia's bomber fleet, plus the contradictory reports that are coming out of the Middle East right now. That conversation from Faith Nation this week is today's main thing.
Ivana, how big of a blow is this for Moscow, both militarily and strategically?
This is immensely important. This is probably one of the most important attacks since 2022, because more than 100 Ukrainian drones actually targeted air bases deep inside Russia, aiming specifically at nuclear-capable long-range bombers. It was just an incredible operation because Ukraine actually used trucks and smuggled drones inside Russia, and they were close to 4 Russian air bases. So Russian analysts and bloggers call this Russia's Pearl Harbor, and there is a good reason why they analyze this in this way, because this is important militarily and strategically. So Zelensky basically stated that 40 Russian aircrafts, which is 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missiles carriers, they were targeted. And their Ukrainian security service, they claim that this actually costs Russia $7 billion. But this is not only important militarily, this is immensely important also strategically, because this shows Russia's weakness. Russia, of course, downplayed this whole situation, but it also shows that Ukraine will not give up, and this will actually strengthen Ukraine's position in talks. Because make no mistake, Putin does not want to have negotiations in good faith. Some people may wonder, if this can actually escalate the war. I don't think so, because the only language that Putin understands is the language of power. So he's just buying more time, to reposition the military and continue with the attacks. And this war will not stop at Ukraine unless we stop it before that.
Costly both militarily and strategically. Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Ivana is absolutely right. And I think the key point is that this incredibly audacious operation has weakened Russia militarily. But I don't think that we can rest on our laurels and assume that the war is won for Ukraine, or that Russia doesn't pose a threat to other frontline states in the region, in the Baltics, in Eastern Europe, that could potentially face Russian aggression down the line.
I want to follow up after just citing this. Russia and Ukraine, as we mentioned earlier, are meeting in Turkey. They only agreed to a prisoner swap in Turkey. Ivana, as a follow-up, does the strike, as you suggested, strengthen Ukraine's position in the peace talks, or does it risk escalating the conflict even further?
I actually don't think that this might escalate. I'm quite certain that Putin might complain to Washington how actually Ukraine didn't show any effort to negotiate. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Putin really understands only the language of power. And Ukraine understands very well that the only way that Ukraine can negotiate with Russia if they put Russia on the defensive, because Russia can always just pack their stuff and leave Ukraine if they believe that this war will end. But as I mentioned, I'm very concerned that Putin just wants to buy more time to reposition his military and to continue, as Ben emphasized, already different security services from the Baltic states, from Poland, are warning that this war might not end at Ukraine.
All right, a lot happening in the world. I want to move on to another topic. There's another set of high-stakes negotiations brewing right now in the Middle East. Iran now appears poised to reject the latest U.S. nuclear proposal. Ben, how serious is the standoff right now, and what are the risks if talks do collapse with tensions so high across the region?
Well, John, it's actually not really clear whether there is a standoff, because there are contradictory reports coming out. Some reports are saying what you said, that Iran is poised to reject this deal. But in the last hour or two, more reports have been emerging that, in fact, the US may present a proposal to the Iranians that is more acceptable to them. Now, what would that involve? It would allow the Iranians to carry on with some limited domestic uranium enrichment. The key divide here is over whether Iran should be allowed to enrich uranium domestically. Of course, uranium being the fuel that is the precursor to creating a nuclear weapon. Now, publicly, the stance of this administration has been that Iran should have no enrichment capacity at all. President Trump has said that in recent days. Vice President Vance reiterated it. No domestic enrichment capacity. That has been the stumbling block, because the Iranians have said that for them it's a non-starter. So I think to some extent it's a question of who blinks first. But I would add that even if the US does dilute its position to some extent and allows a degree of uranium enrichment, it may not be enough for the Iranians to sign up to a deal. Ben. As for your broader question, what happens if this standoff ends, or if they're not able to reconcile these positions? I actually, in some ways, don't think that very much changes. In the sense that I don't believe that Iran is pursuing these negotiations in good faith to begin with. I think it's a delaying tactic. Okay. You know, we've seen several intelligence reports in recent days that would underline that.
Ben, we just have a few seconds left, but while I have you, I want to ask you about Gaza and some disturbing reports of civilians shot while trying to collect aid. Israel insists it didn't fire on them, while Hamas says otherwise. How do we cut through these competing narratives in the few seconds we have left?
Well, I think, look, really what was leveled at Israel yesterday was a blood libel. You had a lot of media outlets claiming that Israeli tanks had opened fire on innocent civilians without really checking the evidence here. And we've seen that rebuffed by both the Israeli Defense Forces and also by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is this private agency that is delivering aid in Gaza. They have denied that there was any firing by Israeli troops, and they've actually provided video of masked men, presumably Hamas gunmen, opening fire on those civilians. So I think what it shows is there's a real aid crisis in Gaza, and the international community needs to think very creatively about delivery mechanisms now.
I wish we had more time. Ivana Stradner and Ben Cohen, both with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much.
All right, appreciate that conversation there. And that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
We are looking at Hebrews 13:6 today. It says, "So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I will have no fear. What can mere people do to me?"
Yeah, I love that verse, because really so many times we're worried about man, and we think about the things we do and how other people are going to think about it. But we have that audience of one that there's really nothing anyone can do to take away from how God views you when you're following him. So great verse, great spot to leave it on this edition of the Quick Start Podcast. As always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.